Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and we're here
And
for Christianity in Process. Yeah, you can say your name, Andrew. Come on.
Andrew.
Yeah. That is Andrew Schwartz, Executive Director of the Center for Process Studies.
Pew, 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 pew.
You like your air horn?
I do.
You do?
Yeah.
That's what I like to hear. Well, this is a lot of fun because you've been on the podcast before. We are obviously been friends for a while, but we're doing this intro to process theology, and John Cobb is talking with everyone each week. And I mean, I'm just saying he's probably taught a lot of people process theology, given he's 97 and has been doing it for a while. But this is the first time he's done it with a couple thousand people on the internet. And so I said, I want to bring in each week a different person for a conversation to show the breadth, depth, and how process tradition plays out in other parts of religious life and such. I thought it'd be fun for you to tell me why you think I picked you. Yeah, I mean, what do you think if you think of our friends that we've all friends and part of the process community, from like John Gill to Joe Bracken, Donna Bowman, Catherine Keller, Jacob Erickson, you like what's the trajectory do you think was going through my mind that said, I want Andrew to tell his story of how he ended up in the process party?
Well, I'm a little bit younger than Joe Bracken.
Yeah. I mean, Joe Bracken's 5 years younger than John Cobb. Joe Bracken's only 92.
I don't know. That's a good question. I'm happy to be here. There are so many other people you could have gone with because the process community is not as small as it sometimes feels. I do love John Cobb. So I don't know if that's a strength or a weakness in this case. If you're looking for, alternatives to Cobb, mostly I think if I have an idea that is in disagreement with John Cobb, I need to align myself with the truth.
Wow.
So I take a minute, breathe it in, say, all right, what does the Cobb father have to teach me today? So
you're a member of the Cobby lobby?
The Cobby lobby, yes. Selling the window to your soul. I went to Pilgrim Place where John Cobb lives last week, and for the first time introduced him to my now 10-month-old son. He may have cried upon arrival, staring into the face of this near century-old human being. And then he stopped, and then he started to embrace it. And I got some great pictures of Cobb kissing my child, which means he is forever blessed. So it's good times.
Oh, yeah.
I'm excited.
Now, maybe it was that your child now bears the blessing of John Cobb that got you here.
Probably.
But I mean, it could also be that you didn't get here by the same means other people have.
That's true.
We're in this very elite group of people first witnessed to by Tom Ward that ended up getting their PhD at Claremont. And for people who don't know, Claremont was where John Cobb taught for a long time, Methodist school. For the seminary part, and there's a graduate school connected to it. And Tom Ward, who most of you will know if you're listening to this, because we're doing a little thing right before the class starts, is the one that introduced me to the open relational theological conversation and all that kind of jazz. But for Andrew, Tom was his professor in the Nazarene context. So when you think of, going from, well, one, a child, and then encountering religion, coming to belong to it, and then connecting to the Nazarene tradition. How did that story of faith go for you to end up asking the questions, to end up, meeting process thought and it becoming a home?
Yeah. When I was a child, I thought like a child. But I now have put childish ways behind me and embraced process theology. So, as you said, I went to Northwest Nazarene University for my undergrad. Why did I do that? Because I was going to a Nazarene church prior to going to college. So throughout my childhood. Why did I do that? Because my mom's like, now that I have kids, I got to figure out how to instill morals in them. We should probably send them to church. But what church? And then she remembered her grandmother saying, those Nazarenes are good Bible believing people, which is not what my great grandmother sounded like. And then I was like, oh, great. So then she found the Nazarene church in our town, and that's where I went. And then when I was looking to go to college, I was like, if I'm going to be a Christian, like a real Christian, like committed, I can't just like do it once a week on Sundays. Like, I got to go all in. Like, this is life and death. In fact, this is more important. It's eternal life and eternal death. Like, no joke, right? So
yeah,
I was like, well, I gotta. Oh yeah.
That was the life and death noise.
Thank you. So I was like, well, I need to devote my entire self, and that includes my career, to the service of God. What could be more important than that? So I was like, well, instead of being a rock star, maybe I should go into ministry. Not that those are mutually exclusive. We can name some of our friends who have done both. So then I was like, well, where am I going to go to school to study ministry? Church of the Nazarene made a whole lot of sense. That was the school in my region in Idaho. And my grandfather found out that I could have gone to school in Nampa, Idaho, or the sister school in San Diego, overlooking the ocean. And when he found out that that was an option and I chose Idaho, he basically thought I was a moron for the rest of his life.
Yeah. Well,
and, he's not wrong. Yeah, I know, right? How my life would have been different. I would have probably been introduced to process thought through Tom Ward's cousin, Michael Lodahl, who teaches down at Point Loma Nazarene University, rather than through my, am I an Ordian? I don't know how that works. Anyways, so
you could be
I'm going to college. I'm studying theology and religion with an eye toward like pastoral ministry. And this is before I even take an Ord class. I'm like, this is a lot different than Sunday school. Mostly, I was wowed by the amount of diversity and complexity within Christian history and thought. Like, there wasn't just a single version of the Bible. There wasn't, the way that the Bible came to being was a little more not so straightforward as I thought. As a canon, the canonization process, the integration of different traditions and powers and politics and all these sorts of things. So that started leading me to sort of ask these like questions about like truth and theology and salvation, and appreciate the diversity of those things, which then took me but like instead of focusing primarily on like ministry, whatever that would mean, I wasn't even sure at the time, and my call, I was like starting to be more and more intrigued by these theological like sort of issues. So then when I finally did take my first class, my systematic theology class from my dear friend, Thomas J. Ord, it was not so much a systematic theology class. Now that I reflect on it, it was really more of a philosophy of religion class. Some people might not appreciate the nuance, but I did, because we were asking like these really cool questions about arguments for the existence of God and suffering and evil and all these sorts of things. And sort of that thread throughout for him was both Wesleyan in nature and process theology in nature. And I loved it. I was taken into it. It just made sense.
Yeah.
Like a God that is relational, loving, interactive, where my prayers actually matter and make a difference, where my life matters and makes a difference. My decisions matter and make a difference. Like all that sounded great. So that was my first entry into process thought, was sitting in systematic theology in Tom Ward's class.
So before you got in that class, you had enough. You carried into class a stack of questions that you had the experiences of faith that made you obviously pursue an educational track that could fit with ordination and trying to make sense of them. And then you had like the intellectual questions. And I think that gap between the questions that come from living in our world that occasion a lot of questions, and then the reality of our own experience with the divine, then there's this gap. And you're right. A lot of times those theological questions end up requiring kind of philosophical tools, because we're at a point where we're much more aware that there are a multiplicity of religious traditions that generate the experience of connection, of flow, of divine connect, all that, whatever way you want to do a cross-cultural statement of sorts. And then
There's all the conversations that involve abstracting from particular cultures or religions to go like, how are they related? How are they connected? And then the way the sciences that have emerged in, since modernity impact them. And I feel like that gap between the affirmation of experience in a particular tradition and an affirmation of source of meaning, purpose, value, creativity, and such, that gap is where process philosophical tools help the theologian that's dealing with the gap.
Yes. Did you just say that process theology offers a God of the gaps? Is that what you said? Is that, well, never mind. Forget that. Anyways,
look, that was a nerd triggering response. For those of you that didn't get it, you should just be glad. You probably have less student loans than Andrew and I do.
Yeah, it wasn't even funny. So yes, 100% for me. I'm like, process theology helped me to have a faith that actually made sense to like modern sensibilities and insight. So it was like compatible with science, compatible with religious experience, compatible with the tradition, or at least certain interpretations of like how the tradition should have been. And in my context as a child, like, I mean, growing up, like, I had questions and I did all the Bible studies and memorization. I was in Awanas. I got all the patches. Like I was there, like I could memorize, I was watching Carmen music videos. I knew about the champion.
You knew about the champion, but did the champion know about you?
Yeah. See, that's a theological question.
Here's a question. If everyone that's in the group watching this, if you got the Carmen and champion reference, then just let us know, because if you didn't, if you did get it, put a link in the discussion box, because someone needs to watch a random Baptist church do a reenactment to Carmen's The Champion. Also, a complete aside, Andrew, there's a chance you may be involved in a reenactment of Carmen at Theology Beer Camp Contemporary Christian Music Karaoke Night. I'm just saying. I volunteer for tribute. Yeah. Count me in. Well, you got to stop. You're counting wrong. 8, 7, 6. All right. Sorry. You go ahead. People that don't know Carmen Dower, like, what are they talking
about? Michael W. Smith, Jars of Clay, all the good stuff. Yeah. Yeah. Anyways, so when the hard questions were being like coming up, as they naturally do, I mean, even like little kids like ask the really tough questions, like, why did Jesus have to die? Like, how is Jesus God, but like also not God? Like, I mean, I don't know. People have these, questions like, how do you make sense of the Trinity, salvation, why we're here, what happens when we die, why do we suffer, why doesn't God stop suffering, all these sorts of things. And I feel like a lot of my experience in the church was basically an encouragement to not ask those questions, but to accept mystery on the basis of faith, which in that context of people, I think really just meant believing something that you don't understand. And I definitely think that, in the face of like ultimate reality, the nature of things, like mystery, a healthy dose of mystery is not a bad thing. But I also think that sometimes we use mystery as a cop-out for encouraging people to stop thinking. Yeah. And I didn't want to be encouraged to stop thinking. I wanted to ask the hard questions and do the best I could to see if I can make sense of answers that were compatible with both my reason and my experience. Two arms of the Wesleyan quadrilateral.
Ooh, well, let's just say that if you get theological with Wesley, there's 4 arms involved. And so when you talk about the way kind of philosophy reshapes how you ask certain questions and how you think about it, how did the cultivation of kind of the kind of questions that philosophers of religion ask change the way you understood the experiences of the divine you had in your, Nazarene religious context? Your parents had an impulse, right? Like, we want our child to connect to these deep moral values that are in the world. And we know religions are doing these things, right? Like, and here's the recommendation for a good kind. And then in that, you connected to it in a way that it pulled your identity in ways that were, a different kind of intensity that, led to the vocational quest. Now, when a lot of us have had those experiences of being born in a place where then you're given a tradition and it's a positive one, right? Tons of people have tons of trauma connected to their religious upbringing. Some, it was a blessing. It sent you off. And while your perspective's gotten bigger, it's easier for you to articulate it with this kind of thread of continuity, that the mystery's gotten bigger, but you're still seeking it. And it's moved across the kind of boundaries you thought were there. When you think of the tools of a philosopher of religion, looking back at something they may still participate in, but they participate differently. How did you feel that out? Because a lot of people, the moment they start to move beyond kind of full naive participation in a religious tradition or a mythopoetic structure, they feel like they're separating from it. Philosophers of religion are like, oh, that's intriguing.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a tough thing. I think it's certain when I start thinking critically about my religious experience, thinking critically about the songs we're singing during a worship service or what the minister's saying during a sermon, about how somebody interprets a scripture, or anytime somebody says, oh, well, I'm so sorry, your Nana died, but God has a bigger plan and God's ways are bigger than higher than our ways. And I mean, my mind, my theological brain is spinning, right? And I'm thinking about all these things that people are saying in a new lens that was different from like prior to like my formal theological training. I think, but for me, like the idea that theology is a faith-seeking understanding, that understanding part that we're in search of, that's important. And I think one of the things that helped me sort of stay within the tradition during that process was being in conversation and communion with like other professors, other theologians, like people who were also asking these questions. Most church congregations, or at least the ones I've been a part of, it's not just filled with a bunch of like weird PhD people who are like asking philosophy, theology questions. Like, it's just like normal people with common sense, and the common sense not to take out 6 figures in student debt in order to get a PhD that you can't land your job. That's aside. Sorry. That's the secret of higher education. So being in touch with people like Tom Ward, when I graduate and then we become friends, and I'm able to, be in conversation with them, I realized basically that I wasn't alone, that there were other Nazarenes, there are other Wesleyans, other Christians who are also asking big questions and struggling with them and having different answers and conversations. And that there was sort of a place for these dialogues that take place outside of the 4 walls of any particular church congregation was sort of affirming for me. Where things maybe went astray was actually as my relationship with the denomination became more and more of an exclusive one, where basically I was told you have to separate your academic questions from your, what you say behind a pulpit. You have to, asking questions is a slippery slope to the devil. You got to just believe without asking questions. We don't want to encourage that, because then people have a faith crisis. Questions are bad because questions lead to like doubt, and doubt's the opposite of faith. And I'm like, maybe doubt's the beginning of understanding, but nevertheless. So I guess what I'm saying is it's not easy, and it didn't actually work out as I would have hoped. For example, when I lost my ministerial credentials with the Church of the Nazarene. For example.
Yeah. I think a lot of, at least people, anyone that ends up in something like this, that are have had leadership positions in churches, get that tension. And some of it is because, where any community or denomination or something is, and the way that particular body is wrestling with issues, right? Like a heresy one generation is normative the next sometimes, and other times something is labeled heresy in scare quotes generates the response, helps the church get back to like a better kind of clarity, right? So it's always this living thing, but when you get caught up in it, and that kind of rejection is different than other ones, right? Like, short of thinking you're in a Job situation, right, where God has it out for you, the next most painful thing is to have your church or your family do it.
And oftentimes they're connected, right? Like earlier today, I talked to a friend of mine whose parents didn't talk to him for like 11 years after he came out. And he had reconnected with one of his family members, and it was a powerful experience. But you're sitting there thinking, there's almost nothing like short of really believing, God has it out for you that would get anywhere near your family or church, or sometimes both, getting there. And I'm always struck by how someone processes the pain, trauma, and rejection and differentiates that kind of pushback and the intimacy and risk that's there, and yet still goes, what they gave me, my faith and the context it flourished in, I'm preserving. Does that make sense? Because I think there's a whole lot of people right now that grew up in a white evangelical space, and then after Trump, they're like, oh, junk, this is cray cray. Right. And that their family and their church are like, you're leaving Christianity behind. But I think you and I would both agree, like, if I don't know, if white supremacy, eco denial, and militarism are chasing you out the door, it's probably good to leave. But does that make sense? Do you have wisdom in that process of being to navigate those spaces?
Oh yeah, let me give you some wisdom right here. No, I'm just kidding. No, probably not. But I will say, from my experience, something that I found helpful was remembering the church is diverse. So it was like the very first aha moment when I started studying theology as like a 18-year-old freshman, is also the thing that still keeps me engaged and interested today. There is no one size fits all Christianity. Different people believe different things. They do different things. They act differently in the world. They engage differently. They're in different degrees of openness and closedness. And even within a particular denomination or particular congregation, some people may be much more affirming to somebody who's questioning and seeking, whereas other people may be super exclusive and say, no, you can't ask questions because those threaten me and what I believe. Because usually what it means is not, I don't want you asking questions so far as I don't want your questions to sort of like taint my belief and start to get me to ask questions because I don't have good answers. And then what if I don't believe in God and then I go to hell? Oh no, right? So, fear does funny things to people, but Christianity is big enough, and sort of even outside of traditional Christianity, God is big enough for there to be a place for you, regardless of what you believe and who you are. There's a place for you. So feeling free to sort of find that place. I would just say it takes courage, and it can be a painful journey, but don't stay in a place where you're feeling like you don't belong or that you have to like deny who you really are, whatever that means, in order to sort of belong to a closed-minded, exclusive community. It's just not worth it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, underneath those kind of observations about, in some sense, a tension between an individual, whatever the community they may or may not belong to at any point, and then this kind of bigger reservoir of the divine that leads to, those intuitions come from somewhere, right? And underneath it for you is a process vision of the way God and the world relate. Now, I want to end up getting to talk about things like pluralism or ethical questions around like something like the ecological crisis and such. But when you think about the task of a religion and how they may relate to each other, that only makes sense once it's nestled in kind of like the bigger doll, nesting doll of the God and world relationship. So what's the kind of basics or outline of that perspective for you that enables you to have cohesive threads running through big questions like pluralism, or like thinking ethically about the ecological crisis and those kind of things?
So one is, just the belief that, God is good and loving, right? So the idea that we've got a God worthy of worship, a loving God that actually cares about us and the world, I feel like is a big foundation for most Christianity, but also especially process theology. If God were some sort of evil demon that just didn't care about us, or some distant deity out there that sort of didn't give two shakes about the world, it's like, well, what's the point? A create and run kind of a situation is not really like what we want. So that God cares, I think, is one step. But then the other is like, okay, so if God does care, then how does God relate to the world? And for me, that's where the process really reframed things for me, because I already had the idea that God cares. God is love as like part of my theological framing. But the idea of how God interacts with the world, I remember, being a younger, more conservative Christian that would sit out on the porch with my Bible open, waiting for the wind to blow over the right page so that I can know the message that God wanted for me at that specific moment. And that, later I'd go to the store and I would pray for God to find me a good parking spot close to the door. And when he did, I would be like, yes, thank you, God, you are awesome. And then forget about the fact that there are people starving in the world and dying all the time. And somebody was diagnosed with cancer the other day. And then, but God made sure that my football team won, right? So like God is big enough to care about the tiny minutia in my life, but somehow too small to take care of like real problems. And that just was incoherent. It didn't make sense. And the more I started to push on that, the more I realized that I had a problem with how I was understanding the way that God works in the world. I wanted to believe that God does something in the world, yet if God is truly good, then why do all these bad things happen in the world? God's strong enough to find me a parking spot, but not strong enough to cure a disease. Like, what's going on, right? And again, that's where you get to this, mystery ends up being like a big common answer for people. So what I found in process thought was an alternative to the doctrine of omnipotence, the sort of notion that God sort of unilaterally, single-handedly determines everything. And instead, a view of God as working cooperatively and persuasively with the world, sort of co-creating a future together, which also puts more responsibility on me as a person to carry out God's will, in seeking the kingdom of God here and now. But also, it helped to, basically, it was a way of explaining why bad things happen, yet God could still be good.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, and so that would mean a process, a particular kind of panentheism. How would you kind of invite people to think about or kind of like understand the process version of panentheism?
Ooh, that's a tough one, because I'm not sure if there is a single process version of panentheism.
Well, since this is an intro class, Andrew, and people are very interested. Andrew and I have a podcast episode where we taunt other panentheisms to not being as cool as a very Claremont interpretation of process panentheism. But let's just assume.
Okay, so
that your
basics,
version
right?
is the normative one for the next 30 minutes.
Perfect. Which as it should be. So
all right.
Panentheism basics, right? It's pan, so all, n, which is an en, but it sort of means in, like in. Won't get worried about that.
If they're from the South, an I and an e are not that distinct.
Truth. And then it's theism, right? So all is in God. That's basically what it means. That describes, in a very literal sense, the idea that the world is bound up in God. The world is related to God, that God's not separate from the world, but intertwined with the world. It also, on the flip side of that, is not just that the world is present to and in God, but that God is also present to and in the world. So there's sort of a mutual immanence. So some theologies describe a God that's sort of out there. Even when we say the Lord's Prayer, right? Our Father in heaven. So not our Father here, not, hey, God, who's continuing to be an active presence and that's making the world a more loving and gracious place. No, it's God like out there, right? So process panentheism wants to say God is not somehow sort of distant and other and only occasionally intervenes supernaturally, but that God is always bound up within the world, always acting to alluring and calling us toward the best possible outcomes in the world. So there's not a sense of God supernaturally intervening at any particular moment and then failing to intervene at all other moments, which is how a lot of people explain why some people get healed and other people don't. It's like, oh, well, sometimes God intervenes, sometimes God doesn't intervene. And a process view turns that around and says, it's not that God is like sometimes trying to do good things and sometimes not trying to do good things. God's always working for the good, always actively involved in the world, trying to bring about the best possible outcomes. And that the restrictions are not so much on what God wants, but what's possible in the world, given our own freedom, our own choices, the conditions and environment that we're in any particular moment. So yeah, I would say from an introductory point, that's probably what matters most in a process panentheism.
Yeah, and I think that there's a sense that panentheism as a philosophical perspective kind of opened back up for a lot of theologians, a host of biblical images. A lot of the biblical language about God and the world relating involved a very panentheistic picture, one where the future is also open, where things aren't determined, and the way humans and the impacts the way God responds, and vice versa. And so there's this experience, at least for me, as someone who was always kind of intellectually invested and kind of learned how to be a good reformed person, that the open and relational perspective and process philosophy in particular gave a framework that connected with the scientific worldview and engaged in all the philosophical kind of rigor you want. But it also made the biblical testimony to a living and life-giving God actually more compelling than the vision of God that dominates most classical pictures of the divine. And I remember a moment, and I'm interested if you had this one, where you go, oh, junk. So there's a picture of the world that coheres with the science more, actually makes a better fit with the biblical testimony. It also means things like prayer matter. Like you start going through the list of so many parts, and you're like, it not only like prayer matter, but like maybe God's as nice as the one Jesus calls Abba, right? Like around omnibus, you start like going through this list, and you're like, so what is process theology? And you Google it, and you're like, heresy. Like that experience, it happens to so many people, and it's hard to compute how that panentheistic kind of shift opens back up ways of re-engaging previous ideas, practices, understandings, scriptures, and things in a completely new framework, because you aren't kind of running around trying to like attach with duct tape all the little pieces of our experience, our tradition, what happens at worship, and this kind of stuff to a philosophical picture that is ultimately flawed. So do you remember that kind of experience? Was there a particular question that like triggered where you go, oh, if I just like change out the philosophical operating system, so much of this works better?
It's so true. I mean, in day-to-day life, your average person is probably not talking much about Plato and Aristotle, or, bad-mouthing Rene Descartes.
They weren't a teenager that had got stuck in lockdown with me.
But I will say one of the explanations that I discovered through process literature on why process theology would be called heresy, even though it's so much more compatible with what we see in scripture than classical theism, actually is explained through the classical tradition's adoption of like Platonic philosophy. So you get things like these notions of like a perfect being. You get notions of power as like, being able to control things without being affected by things. And these sorts of frames that are not actually theological in nature, but philosophical in nature, then impose a particular lens on which we interpret theology. So if God is a perfect being and God is the most powerful, then God must be unchanging and God must be unaffected by the world. So these doctrines, what we call in theology, immutability, God's unchanging, and impassibility, God's unaffected, are actually directly tied into the sort of like Greek philosophical lenses that the church began to use to interpret, the theological lens of Christianity. So it's when you replace that with something like a process relational philosophical lens, all of a sudden, you don't need God to be unaffected and unchanging. You can actually embrace a God that is fully the most effective, right? What we might call the most moved mover, that's completely bound up and intertwined with the world, making a difference in the world, but also being, in this give and receive relationship, which just makes so much more sense because it's how all relationships are. It's how any loving relationship is. It's always back and forth, give and receive. And that's what we see described in scripture. That's what we feel in our own spiritual experience. And that's what process theology is describing. Mm-hmm. So really, it's not heresy to the biblical tradition. It's heresy to the Greek philosophical tradition, which probably just needs to be tossed out and replaced anyways.
Well, amen. I think that's really well put. So of all the different things that you've spent energy in publishing, the one that you spent quite a bit of time and worked with John on was religious pluralism. For John has minimized this in the actual class, but so maybe you should say a bit about this before answering my actual question. Like first question is, if someone asks big questions around religious pluralism, why is John Cobb such a big deal? No, you should answer that one. And then I'll ask you the next question, because as you know, if either one of us, not either one of I, that sounds like, what is it? I, me, my, if either one of us had accomplished like 10% of John's, accomplishments, we'd be obnoxious.
Definitely.
So when it goes to the question of religious pluralism, how? Because people have got an idea of the kind of process vision that you're working with and things like how did that enable John to do something different in the philosophical, theological, interreligious conversation than the ways Christian theologians had dealt with it prior?
Yeah. Well, so for those of you who don't quite know what we mean by religious pluralism, it's basically a position within a conversation about is salvation available outside of the church or outside of Christianity? Is truth found in other religions other than Christianity? So the plurality or multiplicity or openness of truth and salvation beyond any particular religious tradition and its borders. So within that frame, you get people who say, no, there's only one way, only one truth, and it sort of excludes all other views. So it gets called exclusivism. There's also a sort of a modified view that tries to be more inclusive, that says, oh no, well, like there is truth found in other religions, but it's not sort of like unique to them. It's like all truth is God's truth. So it's like, it's still Christian truth. It's just sort of Christian truth in new wrapping. And then there's a pluralist position that wants to affirm the multiplicity of truths and the possibility of salvation outside of Christianity, that there is a liberative path in Hinduism, a liberative path in Buddhism, and a liberative path in Christianity, and so on. So two of some of the big figures who promote that sort of last view, that religious pluralist view, are John Hick and John Cobb. And these dual Johns both were professors.
Johns. Yes.
both professors in Claremont, California, mm-hmm. At the same time, right? So now John Hick is really known for his a sort of I guess what you could say has been the dominant pluralist view. We don't have to go into the details of what that is. Cobb So there was interesting. There were a series of two books that came out of some conferences on the myth of Christian uniqueness, which is basically like an apologetics for pluralism, and then there was like Christian uniqueness reconsidered, which is supposed to be like the apologetics for Christian exclusivism or something. And there's two volumes that sort of competed with each other. And Cobb, believe it or not, published in the exclusivist volume. Not because Cobb is an exclusivist, but because the pluralism that was being expressed was not pluralistic enough. And what he basically means by that is, instead of saying there are many different paths up like a single mountain, which would be sort of that traditional John Hick type pluralism, John Cobb wants to acknowledge that maybe not all religions are asking the same questions or trying to achieve the same goals. So there are actually different paths up different mountains, different religious ends. So it's more pluralistic, creating space for religious others to sort of really be different. To not say that nirvana is basically the Christian, the Buddhist version of heaven, like those, maybe they're actually just two different kinds of concepts, that enlightenment in Buddhism and heaven in Christianity are not two different ways of describing the same things, but they're actually different ways of describing different things, right? So instead of it being, it's apples and oranges. Together, they can actually create a well-balanced diet with vitamin C and vitamin A. So, you do them both.
But underneath that, right, is the way in which the category or label religion ultimately problematizes difference.
Correct. So stepping back a bit, John Cobb actually grew up in Japan. His parents were Methodist missionaries there. And so a lot of his like early formative years as a committed Christian were also already being engaged in conversation with Buddhism and Buddhist neighbors. He then became sort of we could call him the Cobb father of Buddhist Christian dialogue. So he and Masao Abe and others sort of putting Zen Buddhism and sort of this process Wesleyan Christianity in conversation together as early as like the 1960s and 1970s. And Cobb's view on sort of how and why we would engage with difference is an embrace of what he calls mutual transformation, which I also think is rooted in this sort of nature of humility, the recognition that sort of we're all doing our best to make sense of these sort of big complex questions. But within the process philosophical frame, and I think this is probably what you're getting at, like maybe the unique process contribution to the pluralism discourse. Instead of saying, as somebody like John Hick might, that there's one religious ultimate, one God, one divinity, and it just goes by different names. John Cobb's process pluralism, rooted in a Whiteheadian view of sort of a multiplicity of ultimates, says, well, actually, maybe there are, it's not just one ultimate with different names, but like actually different ultimates. And you're like, what in the world does that even mean? Different ultimates? I don't know. It's like, okay, so imagine this. Even in the Christian tradition, sometimes you hear God spoken of as like the supreme being. In this sense, it's God's very personal characteristics like love, jealousy, even. And in order for us to have a relationship with God, God must have these sort of personal attributes to relate on a personal level. Yet, you also see in Christian theology, particularly in some mystic traditions, people like Paul Tillich start talking about this. Like you get this notion of God or divinity as also the ground of being or being itself. So there you have what's more described as an impersonal sort of frame or principle that even allows being to exist. So already you have the ground of being, the supreme being as two different ways, right? Impersonal and personal, two different ways of describing what sometimes is categorized as God, which we could just say is an ultimate. So process sees this and says, well, maybe it's not two different ways of describing the same thing. Maybe what we're doing is describing two different things. An impersonal ultimate, That's the ground of being. And in process terms, we might actually call this creativity. And it could actually map onto some of the religious traditions that believe in an impersonal ultimate. So there's, ultimacy out there that is not sort of a divine person, but still is something sort of beyond the world and beyond humanity. And then you have the idea of God as a supreme person. And then that maps on to traditions, in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism that talk about that. But then you also have the world. In some religious traditions that are oriented toward the world as being ultimate, that at the end of the day, like what we see before us is really sort of, so it's the totality of finite things, the collection of the cosmos, right? And that tapping into and relating to that as sort of a sense of ultimacy. So then you have God, creativity, and the world as sort of three distinct yet interconnected ways of describing what is ultimate in the nature of things. So process theology then says, well, maybe that helps explain why the different religious traditions, some talk about the world in sort of an ultimate sense, some talk about the ground of being in an ultimate sense and an impersonal ultimate sense, and others talk about sort of a God as a personal ultimate, that maybe these aren't conflicting descriptions of a single ultimate, but they're actually complementary descriptions of different sort of types of ultimacy. So there's a process philosophical frame that helps to explain why different religions could give different answers to these sort of questions about ultimacy, being oriented towards something different, yet at the same time being oriented towards something that's very real in the ultimate nature of things. So it's a deeper religious pluralism is what process people describe. That was out there. I'm sorry if that may have been a little bit like, ooh, what in the world is he talking about?
Okay, well, let me try to say parts of it back to you, because I personally was like, well, it's clear he's talked about this multiple times. And published about it and all that kind of stuff. But John in the class had talked about the distinction between supreme being and being itself, and that most of our discussions, right, as especially in the West, have been between some account of like the hyper supreme being with all the omnis. That process is like, how are you getting, God is love and omnipotence and the reality of evil and all that kind of stuff there. And then you have the being itself, especially Tillich is a great example. But for Tillich, the ground of being or the unconditioned and all these things, to connect to it is to connect to something that doesn't distinguish difference in any moment. So the contingent reality has distinctions, unconditioned doesn't, because it's not conditioned, it's and those distinctions, and if you're seeking salvation, matter, right? Inequality, injustice, those are distinctions that make a difference. And the idea that that's the exact same thing as enlightenment, where that involves the recognition that those distinctions aren't final, they aren't ultimate, and that releases you from your identity being completely determined by those distinctions. To say that salvation in the distinction, like, I don't know, mountains are knocked down and valleys are filled up if you were Jesus's mom, or just go through the prophets, that's the same thing as recognizing that all particularities have a source that relativizes any privilege and power in a moment. That's enlightenment. They're not the same thing. And for like someone like John Hick, and for a lot of us that grow up in the West and go, there are people on my street in all these other religions and they are better humans than me. What do I do? We're all going up the same mountain at the top. It's cloudy. There's lots of mystery there, but they're all the ones that meditate and probably have their books on Super Soul Sunday. Right? Like that's one temptation. And then you're going to look at everything and go, you are a religion. And what does religion do? It does its thing until you don't know what the thing is, but I promise they all meet in the end. Right? Like that maneuver that we're coming out of wanting to be pluralist, affirming beauty in all the things, actually dissolves the difference. And
what Whitehead enables Cobb, I think, to do, and because he grew up in a context, right, that the normal exclusivist option isn't available, and Hicks already doesn't make sense because he knew how different the traditions were, is to go like, no. What if we aren't going to use the category invented in modernity, religion, and then force a bunch of things into it, and then give one explanation for the whole thing? And that deep pluralism you described is a way to honor difference and distinctions and not collapse them, and recognize that there's a wisdom in each of them, that there's a wisdom to recognizing injustice and seeking a different world. And there's a wisdom in recognizing that there's no power over or under anything, that ultimately undoes the shared reality of all things, salvation and enlightenment, right? Like supreme being and God, ground of being distinctions are kind of essentialized versions of God in the world, God creativity, and in process terms.
Yeah. So basically, if you're listening and you say, I want to be a Christian, or maybe a different religion, okay, I'm not going to judge. John Cobb would say he thinks Christianity is still the best religion, which is why he's a Christian. You can get into that with him sometime if you want. He pretty much loves Jesus and Paul, and he's willing to stand by that. But he's not wanting to say that because he affirms a Christian view, that he has to reject views that are different than Christianity. And how do you find that space that is both affirmation without negation? Right? How can you say I'm a Christian and you're a Muslim, and that I don't have to be anti-you in order to be pro-me? And I think that's what the pluralist is trying to do, is find that space, right? But the way that traditional pluralism in the tradition of John Hick does it is to sort of wash away difference by saying, and this is why by John Cobb and David Griffin refer to Hick's type of pluralism as an identist pluralism, or as even a superficial pluralism, is because it's not ultimately saying different paths, different religions, different truths. It's saying it appears different, but underneath it all, they're really the same. They're all lead to the same end, or they result in the same, goal. The difference is sort of at the level of appearance or at the level of naming, and his sort of reasons for that are sort of built into his adoption of Immanuel Kant's way of seeing the world. And Cobb comes in and says, well, no, I don't think that's good enough. Like, there's something off-putting for a Christian to say, I know what the Buddhist is really saying, even if they don't think that's what they're saying. That kind of colonizing of Buddhist minds from a Western perspective is problematic. And Cobb says, no, what we really need to do is create the space for difference to be different, without trying to say it only looks different, it only sounds different, but it's ultimate. He's like, hey, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's not nirvana. It's something different. Like, it's okay. So difference is actually Andrew. Different in process thought. That's the bottom line.
And I think that is, earlier you talked about his vision of being mutual transformation, right? Like, so that religious traditions actually in their difference enable a different kind of dialogue than seeking sameness. And that in some ways captures, like, what's his Beyond Dialogue, I think is the name of the book, but it's like kind of brightish blue with red lettering. And the subtitle has something to do with beyond absolutism and relativism. And I think when it goes to religious pluralism, those are the easiest temptations to give into, right? For me and a lot of my friends and that are liberal mainline Protestants, the easiest is relativism. And not a relativism that's like, it doesn't matter, but a relativism like, it doesn't matter. like you really everything. Just want to know. It's not like it doesn't matter if you're grounded in something and like being formed in a community for meaning, purpose, value, justice seeking, and all that kind of stuff. No, that's great. It's just like, which one? Nah. And so it's relativistic about any of the unique claims of a tradition, and any of them can function to perform the same task, right? And that's wonderful. And then the absolutist one is where all the differences and particularities become like hills to die on, right? And by the time you get done, it's like the one true biblical Christianity, and it's probably a one that didn't exist until the 18th century. And it doesn't matter to you because you have all the Bible verses worked out, or you could do this for pre-Vatican II. Catholicism, where the Ark of Salvation was the Catholic Church, and everything out of it, well, it's not personal. And don't worry, God hangs the bow up after this. The absolutism, right? I think a lot of people find morally like repugnant, and relativism non-inspiring. And I think that like you hinted at this weird tension in John where he's like, no, like I'm really into Jesus. Like I'm really Christian and things. And I think I'm a better Christian because I've learned a lot from Buddhists, and I couldn't have learned it from my Christian friends. Whatever space that is a different kind of pluralism. I think that's connected to that deep part you were talking about.
Yeah. And I think, so, I mean, obviously, the absolutism piece is more familiar, right? It's like, it's my way or the highway. There's only one right answer. And just so happens that I have that right answer. Lucky me that I was born into the right family or learned the right religion or went to the right church, because now I've got the truth in my pocket. I can carry it around with me, and that's
it is good. Very convenient.
It's very comforting. But I will say the extreme of that, also somewhat convenient to say, oh, well, whatever is true for you is true. Your truth is your truth. My truth is my truth. Let's just agree to disagree. And then you sort of have a almost like a non-position position that wants to say anything goes. That also can be morally repugnant, as you had said, because now it's like, okay, so what do I stand for? Everything is acceptable. Everything is, its own a justifiable path to salvation. Hitler, maybe not so bad from his perspective. Maybe it's okay to, commit genocide and murder all the Jews and other people. Like, it's just a matter of perspective, right? So anything goes depending on what your standpoint is. And that would be the sort of extreme of relativism. And pluralists say, well, I need space to be able to disagree with Hitler, but I also need space to agree with more than just people, to affirm more than just the people who think like me. And that is that sort of both and tension of affirmation without negation that I think is sort of the sweet spot of pluralism. And how do we find a way to embrace others, to embrace difference without giving up on our own convictions? And that's exactly what Cobb has, shown beautifully. Others like him, inspired by him, like Paul Knitter, beautiful book, Without Buddha, I Could Not Be a Christian. I mean, just ponder that for a little bit. And I think you're right. I think Cobb would probably say something similar if it weren't for his experiences with Buddhists and his dialogues with Buddhists. He's a better Christian now today because of his Buddhist Christian dialogue throughout his life. Mm-hmm. I think he would agree with that. Yeah,
no, I think that captures it well. And that idea of mutual transformation, something that shows up even, recently, and giving the example of the way, one of the unique contributions of the Christian tradition that he latches onto is the way that Jesus in some way instantiates the nonviolent resistance option in the human species. And it's connected to one good God that knows and cares and loves for neighbor, nature, and enemy. Right. And then, so what does it mean to embody that? Right. And Jesus does. And then who is it that picks it up in the 20th century but Gandhi? And it transforms the normative religious structure in India.
Yeah.
And I
I remember being I'm just going to interrupt you. I remember being in seminary, thinking about these things and learning about pluralism for the first time and learning about John Cobb for the first time and sitting in church in a small church in Idaho thinking, so Gandhi goes to hell, but the D-bag behind me, kicking the back of my chair is he's going to heaven because he's sitting in the right building and Gandhi was not. I'm like, there's something that doesn't feel right about that. Basically that where you're born and it makes a difference on whether where your eternal resting place will be, heaven or hell, like that. I'm like, wait a second, this just doesn't make sense. And that's a part of what was motivating me to like really think more carefully about religious pluralism. How do I make sense of the fact that Gandhi could also be embraced by God, if that was something that I want, and we can get into whether or not that's what Gandhi wanted, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Well, the thing, especially about Gandhi for capturing, what Cobb's up to, I think, in part is that Jesus inspires him to engage in nonviolent resistance on behalf of the underside. Right. And the metaphysical structure behind the dominant religious expression of Hinduism in Gandhi's space is one where the caste system was justified ontologically, right? Like the caste system that dominated the social cultural framework is one that had a justification connected to a religious structure that had been kind of seized by the powerful to say, like, yeah, our religious structure believes in, Brahman is Atman. Atman is Brahman. And so all the distinctions that make a difference, ground of being style, if you think Paul Tillich style, like all those distinctions that make a difference. If you do the, cheesy ground of being version, I think Paul Tillich's version is a little bit better, or Western Buddhism, or any of these things where you're fit to a system and you're able to deal with the anxiety and pain and stuff because the distinctions aren't ultimately ultimate. John's like, yeah, that's a problem. Now we have problems of our own. If you want to ask Mother Earth what the side effects of Western monotheism are. But Gandhi introduces this wisdom from another tradition, and it transforms the tradition he's in. He doesn't leave it behind. And it actually brings about this beautiful response to imperial colonialistic logic and such that was in the received tradition and the colonizing one. And then what does Gandhi inspire? The reintroduction of that vein in a vibrant way in the civil rights movement through Martin Luther King. And so, like, when John gives that example, it's showing in ways that there are gifts in different traditions that can transform the other tradition. And it's precisely by being different that the transformation happens, rather than relativizing the difference and, in some sense, ultimately supporting the world as it is and its problematic structures and perversities.
Yeah. And since you've name dropped, MLK, it's probably worth mentioning that there's some evidence that he was influenced by process theology.
You mean that he voluntarily took a Whitehead seminar and then did the assignment and got an A on it when he was a PhD student?
For example.
That's one. And
anyway, so
and he wrote on he wrote on, right, empiricist style process theology in Tillich for his dissertation.
Mm-hmm. But I think so. Why in the world do we call it process theology if it's all about relational loving God? Why don't we just call it relational theology? Well, some people do. That's a whole nother discussion. But the process piece is the recognition that sort of reality is always moving, always flowing. It's in process, right? And I think that if you take that same frame and you apply it to religion, a static Christianity is a dead Christianity, and that's not adequate. We need a Christian faith and a Christian tradition that is in process with the rest of the world, that's continually adapting and reinventing itself for a new context and And I think that's what process theology is offering us to do. Another one of the reasons why it sometimes gets sort of pigeonholed as a heresy is because it actually challenges tradition. It doesn't just, sort of accept it. And people rightfully say, well, what gives you the right to question tradition? What makes you think you know more than, Augustine? It's like, well, because his name's Augustine, and second, it's I get it. Okay, I get that tradition's important, and there is definitely some I can see why people would think it seems arrogant that process thinker, theologian, or philosopher would want to privilege their own reason and insight over that of the people who came before. But it's also kind of super practical to do that. Don't we always privilege our own perspective? And even if you change your perspective to adopt somebody else's perspective, in that very act, it becomes your perspective. So you can never actually avoid privileging your own viewpoint because it's always your viewpoint that you're knowing and believing from. We sort of take that with us. So anyways, I'd like to say, yes, I think process can respect tradition while also challenging it. And that's actually a very healthy and natural thing for all of us to do if we want a faith that is living and interactive with an ever-changing world in process.
One last thing, I realize that my list of questions and topics we won't get to because, well,
dude, we could do a rapid fire round.
No, we're not going to do rapid fire because I actually want you to talk about I want you to talk about ecological civilization, because underneath that pluralism discussion is the way in which a process framework enables you to deal with a seeming distinction and abstraction that's been kind of fossilized and then created these difficult problems between religious traditions, because everyone assumed they were running monopolies, right, rather than franchises of sorts. And that distinction generates a lot of problems. Another one that Whitehead spends time on is the way in which we've bifurcated nature. That in the modern world, the explanatory power of science has given so much power to one way of engaging the world, usually involving epistemological distance, experiencing the world as an object to be interpreted so you can understand, possess that power, and then generate predictable, repeatable responses for your own kind of hypothesis or hypothetical agenda of sorts. That bifurcation of nature, the power of that one kind of engagement has led us to mute, silence, and disengage another kind of way of engaging the world, connected to meaning, purpose, value, that kind of stuff. And it's created a space where the authority of a late modern capitalist world is one, when people use the word neoliberal and all that market logic and all that kind of stuff, it's the world we call reality through that enlightenment frame that involves those distancing maneuvers and the way the scientific frame gets immanentized and authorized of sorts. And Whitehead's not dismissing that, but recognizing that mode of engagement is not the only mode of engaging the world. And so there's this whole other part of life. And one of the projects that you've put a lot of energy in around thinking about ecological civilization and such is the impact of dealing with a nature muted, a nature bifurcated. And I think a lot of people right now are getting more and more aware of the ecological crisis, but not that it's something generated by a way of viewing the world. Right? In the process relational framework you've talked about from the beginning of the conversation, like how you answered your religious questions and all that kind of stuff, panentheism, thinking about religious verse, all these things are connected to a vision that sees that bifurcation of nature as ultimately generating the kinds of problems that we can't address without, responding or redressing the bifurcation itself. you did a rather remarkable job spelling out multiple books worth around religious pluralism in a short time. So, what's the cliff notes for thinking? What do we do with civilization from a process perspective when we see this bifurcation of nature taking place?
Well, so
and that was not a very good question. It was more of like a long ramble that set up for you to say things.
I hear your ramble, and I will. So here's the thing. So a lot of Christianity is anti-science, right? Why? Because, we can't make sense of, evolution. We can't make sense of, creation and all these sorts of things from our interpretation in sort of somehow see that that's compatible with the scientific explanation. So science must be wrong in order for me to hold on to my faith. And process says, maybe they actually are compatible and we need a faith that makes sense to our modern sensibilities. So already, there's a bunch of Christians that are sort of anti-climate change peeps because they're basically sort of anti-science peeps. And process does not do that. The other thing that process does not do is say that, there is no climate crisis because nothing's really in crisis. God is in control. And if God wanted to sort of stop global warming, God would just do it in that moment and unilaterally. We don't have to worry about it. There is no problem. It's all under control, right? Which sounds like the captain of the Titanic being like, everybody stay calm. It's all under control as we're all going down. And it's like, well, I'm sorry, but despite this beautiful violin playing on this upside down ship, I think maybe we have a problem. So because process offers an alternative to the traditional doctrine of omnipotence as God in unilateral, single-handed kind of power and control, process says, well, actually, we have a moral responsibility to address the major social and environmental challenges of our time. Inequalities, racism, environmental degradation, all these sorts of things are not things we just close our eyes and say, Jesus, take the wheel, hope you fix it. We have a responsibility to do something about these things. So then it's like, okay, well, what in the world does process actually have to say about doing something about these things? And on that note, you already hinted to the fact of this shift from a mechanistic worldview to an organic worldview, right? Whitehead's philosophy of organism, which we call process philosophy, because an organismic worldview will make all our immature people chuckle. And what it basically says is, like I had said before, right? A religion that doesn't adapt and change is a dead religion. Same with the world. If the world is like a machine, then it's basically dead. And what process does is takes an organic view of the world rather than a mechanical one and says the world is not dead, it's alive. We have a living earth, and that the well-being of people, humans, and all life is dependent on the well-being of that living earth. It also says that everything's interconnected. Right. So it's another core principle of process thought. So it's not, so saving the whales and saving the rainforest and addressing systemic racism are not actually all separate things that we need to devote our time to separately. They're actually part of a whole web of complex problems. So there's a sort of systems orientation to the way that process understands the environmental and social crises as one that's sort of complex and interconnected. Echoing, a lot of the same things that are said by Pope Francis in Laudato Si. We don't have two separate problems, one social, one environmental, but we have one complex crisis, right? That's both social and environmental. And so when we talk about in the process movement of an ecological civilization, it's civilization in the sense of we're trying to speak as broadly as we can about sort of everything about how human life is organized, our systems of education, politics and governance, our economies, the way we do agriculture, the way we do, anything, right? Energy and transportation and, fill in the blank. And rethinking those from an ecological lens. What does that mean? Partly it means rethinking them in the terms of sort of long-term sustainability, the long-term well-being of people on the planet. It also means seeing these as interconnected, complex wholes and systems, not sort of fragmented issues. and seeing this as dynamic and self-organizing. So we need, instead of economies that are primarily built around the pursuit of unlimited wealth and growth, we have economies that are built around health and well-being. That's a whole different frame that then has implications for how we structure market exchange. So it's not saying we got to get rid of economic interaction. It's the same thing with agriculture. It's not saying, oh, well, we have to stop growing food. I mean, that would make no sense, right? We want the well-being of people on the planet depends on food, but the way that we're doing agriculture that treats nature as a machine says, listen, I don't care about the health of the topsoil. I don't care about biodiversity. I don't care about bees. I only care about how much wheat I can grow and harvest with a single tractor in order to make the most profit with the least amount of cost to me. Because ultimately, this is not about the health of people or the planet. It's about profit and power for agribusiness. So process thought and ecological civilization is putting in a new worldview, an ecological worldview, a process worldview that says everything's interconnected, everything's in process, all life has value. You get the panentheism extended to what in process people call pan-experientialism, that sort of gives subjectivity to all living things, not just to human things. And it sees humanity as part of, not separate from nature, overcoming that alienation you talked about. And it's funny because when you start to do that, it changes everything. If you flip the switch and all of a sudden you go from a dead earth view that's only has instrumental value, it's only valuable insofar as it serves my personal needs or my human needs. And then you shift that and he says, no, the earth has its own intrinsic value and it's valuable in and of itself. That living earth perspective changes how we organize human life and is the kind of sort of fundamental paradigm shift needed to address the environmental crisis rather than attacking carbon mitigation separate from attacking poverty, separate from attacking, something else. It's all part of this reframing of our story and our systems for people on the planet.
Yeah. Oh, all right. So I really feel like you did a good job again. So I might like you and I'm really wrong, but in my head, you've managed to give a picture of panentheism and pluralism and ecological civilization and introduce us to more of the process framework. Now, there's one other thing I want to ask you about before we wrap up. You are a new dad. I remember becoming a new dad, and I know a lot of people that know the experience of becoming a new dad. And it's hard to communicate the existential impact of such a thing. What have you learned in the last 10 months? I'm genuinely interested because there are very few times you have adult friends that they've had an experience that will force them to reflect on things they haven't thought about or see it in a new way. And I was like, wow, we're recording. I'll have to say something. So what's been that experience of watching the arrival of life, becoming a father, and all this entailed?
All right, so I will avoid describing the birthing process, which I did get to witness.
I feel like that's a safe move.
Yeah, but I also will avoid talking too much about the fact that my child is like 4 times bigger than I expected him to be, and makes me question who his real father is. Probably Shaquille O'Neal or somebody along those lines, because he's just too big to be mine. But we don't have to get into that. He's cute. It's awesome. And I realize there's an immense responsibility on me to minimize the amount of screwing him up. It's kind of like like a doctor, it's like, oh, I'm going to do no harm. And it's like, well, I do got to cut you open to do the surgery. So maybe there's some harm, but maybe I'm not doing it on purpose, right? What it's gotten me to do actually is all jokes aside, is like to really reflect on my own experience as a child, to reevaluate my own assumptions about the way that I talk, the way that I act, the example that I want to lead, dealing with my own trauma and my own baggage, and trying to figure out how to get my own sort of mental health and well-being in check, so that I can try to minimize the amount of baggage that I pass on. I want to give good, I want to give him good tools for having a happy and successful life, not a bunch of things that he has to go to a therapist for the rest of his life. We'll see how that goes. But I've been reading some really cool books though. One called The Whole Brain Child, another one called Yes Brain. There's one called No Drama Discipline. Oh yeah, and one that's How to Stay Human in an Effed Up World. Also a good book. So these sort of psychology books, these parenting books that are helping me to rethink about like a lot of the assumptions that I hadn't really like explored, but it's rethinking some of and examining those is helpful. Kind of like my parents were like, oof, I hadn't thought about religion before, but now that we have a child, we have to figure out how to make sure they, learn morals. There's certain questions that come up, when you're just like, oh, I'm a parent now. I hadn't given much thought to this before, but I got to reevaluate my blah, 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 right? Fill in the gap.
Yeah. It's definitely one of those moments where you realize until you become a parent, or I'm sure there are other ways this happens to people because plenty of people know this and aren't a parent. But at least for me, there was becoming a parent, which I did younger than most people, was one of those moments where you realize that you had been so intimately engaged into receiving the world. And now you're actively engaged in giving the world, sharing it. And the act of parenting is going to be, I guess, unless you hit Yahtzee in some weird dice roll of a life, like the most influential thing you'll ever do. And so it puts all these pressure on you, and you might read those books. The other side of it is you're not even that control of much of it.
Like, exactly what I was going to say. So humans, people are people.
Yeah. And I can't even figure out how to control myself.
Yeah. No. So yeah, the idea that I'm going to sort of put my kid in a bubble and protect them from all suffering and pain and woes, and I'm going to make sure they follow everything. No. Nope. But I hope that my son will grow up feeling unconditionally loved, and that will empower him to be himself in all settings.
Yeah, the way I've talked about it and thinking about it is one, especially early on when you look at most developmental psych kind of things, is like your goal is to affirm them in ways that don't require the statement, right? So that they experience deep trust, because that trust is connected, if you're a process person, to the trust you could have that every moment, no matter where you've been, where you've done, what you've done, and where you've gone and such, you encounter God in the very next moment, luring, calling, and stuff. And then the other side, like other than the affirmation, is like helping them cultivate their attention. Like, what is it they draw their attention to? The kind of values they're responsive to are not things you say at them. There's things you practice with them. And that starts from the very beginning. The way they see you modeling respect and care to the other family members in the space, so many things. But I like the recognition that the two things that struck me were the realizing the kind of parent you are will make a bigger difference than anything you ever convince anyone to, intellectually or whatever. If you're like you and I, if you're in a ministerial or educational kind of thing, like just the amount of output any child you raise has. And the other side is that ultimately you succeed by helping them internalize value rather than forcing it upon them. Takes a different MO.
It sounds like you're not talking about parenting. It sounds like you're talking about theology. the idea of a God that is sort of like unilaterally controlling things, and that you better obey that God, otherwise you're going to end up receiving eternal punishment. So if you don't want to end up being punished and receiving all the wrath of hellfire and damnation, you better straighten up and fly right. Because the MF over there is checking his list and checking it twice and all this kind of stuff, and it's like God's got way one up on Santa when it comes to checking on your moral activities. It's like,
and that explains why trolls are creepy. They're like the elf on a shelf for God.
Well, and I'm like,
those creepy troll or doll eyes.
I don't know about the troll situation, but I will say I think
the fuzzy hair. The little trolls?
I know. I used to cut their hair. It's good times.
Okay. Like I for a second, I was like, do we not all know what trolls are? You see how I'm in the basement. People listening, if you've ever seen any videos of Homebrewed in the last 3 years, I'm in the basement. There was a single troll doll in here in a dark corner, like behind a corner, like in the corner, and the bricks weren't even. It was like on this side. There's this creepy troll doll that is super creep. It's super creep. Anyway,
did it pre-exist your living there?
Oh yeah, we discovered it when we cleared this place out so I could work down here. Like, you can awesome. See this is like bomb builder station. The floors are covered with all sorts of technical equipment, yard instruments, sanders and saws. It was, but there was this little creepy troll. Now you were going to say something important.
I was going to say, well, yeah. So trolls, speaking of trolls, the internet, right? So all jokes aside, it is kind of like, well, do I want to be more like the process God that leads by example? That's not an exception to the principles, but like an exemplification of them, metaphysical or ethical. And that I want to be the kind of God that, not kind of God, but the kind of dad that, well, I don't know. So my wife jokes about the fact that she is my son's creator, and also his sustainer. So his God, I mean, creator and sustainer, you tell me. Anyways, gave him life and sustains his life for 10 months now, through her body. Sounds like God to me. But that aside, we talk about Gaia some other time. I think that a lot of people, myself included, have experienced a religion that leads you feeling self-conscious, feeling ashamed, feeling guilty, and not feeling loved, but always worried that somehow you're going to piss off the divine and you're going to receive this wrath. You're going to lose your salvation credits or something like that. And like,
salvation credits. You don't want to lose those.
Oops, you did it again. Right. So, whereas the process God is like, wait a second, here you go. Now we have a God that can make you, recognize that you are loved unconditionally, a God that's not going to smite you, but a God that's calling you to be your best self in every moment, a God that's leading by example. That's a whole different frame from the scare the hell out of you kind of God to the God that you're drawn to be in loving relationship with. And I think parenting can be the same one. Are you going to be the kind of authoritative, top-down, hierarchical parent that says it's my way or the highway? It's my house, my rules. Or are you going to be the kind of parent that develops, as you said, a deep, trusting relationship that is an example, not a perfect one, because as we've seen in the commercials, you don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent.
I'm glad you're internalizing that now, because it won't take long. Once they start talking, you're not far from telling yourself you've completely failed and you can't believe you failed so quickly. It's The other thing I would just say, no need to moralize preferences. This tension sometimes comes up after you get married and stuff, like each of you from family or origin, you had certain preferences and then you experience them as morally important and it creates all sorts of tension. Yeah. You think it was intense before you had children. Now
preferences and how you parent get moralized and junk gets awkward. And then one of you reads some book or watches some TikTok videos. I will 100%
moralize real mayo over Miracle Whip.
Well, okay, I wasn't asking you to be insane. I just say, yeah, if you're telling me, you're like, look, when he gets older, I'm going to introduce him to really malty East Coast IPAs. I'd be like, whoa, Andrew.
No.
Why would you do such to somebody?
Yeah. There's still a right and wrong. Not relative. We're not talking pluralist.
Yeah. It was. Yeah. Okay. So the last thing I want you to answer, and I'm going to see if I can find the troll while you start answering this question, because my children move it around the basement. Because of your position at Center for Process Studies, you are always a part of kind of new research initiatives and a center for where a lot of new kind of books, text, and things come through. So for people that might be new to process theology and are participating in this class, could you say a bit about kind of new research endeavors you're excited about and kind of new resources or books that you think, if this is something you're interested in and you've spent 6 weeks with John Cobb, like, here's a couple of books you should check out?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is so much going on with the Center for Process Studies specifically, but also the sort of worldwide process community generally, that I'm really excited about. We just did a conference that my colleague Andrew Davis organized, Astrobiology, Exophilosophy, and Cosmic Religion was the title. And if that title leaves you scratching your head wondering what in the world we talked about, we brought in some scientists from NASA and some philosophers and theologians from around the world. And we said, let's talk about the implications of life on this planet, but also beyond this planet. Biological, ethical, theological, implications. That's kind of a fun project. So there is a book going to be coming out on that topic. The Center for Process Study works in so many different areas. Theology is one of them. We've been talking about that here. And within theology, different, parts of different conversations. A recent book came out on process theology and Catholic thought. There's obviously a lot of books being done and work being done on sort of environmental thought and process thought. People are interested in educational theory and process thought. Some of my friends in Arizona, Sandra Labarsky and Mark Ford, launched a new process-inspired college called Flagstaff College that is sort of taking Whiteheadian principles and inspiration of John Cobb and sort of developing an entire curriculum and entire sort of college educational structure around that philosophy. We've got people who are doing work in psychedelic research and sort of rethinking experience and sort of extraordinary experiences from within a process framework. So really, the question is not what is there going on that might interest people. It's a question of what are your interests? And if there's not something that the center is doing right now that that strikes your fancy, why don't we talk and let's figure out about creating something new.
Striking of the fancy. Okay, I found it. Are you ready?
Yes, I am.
This thing was in this room. It was very packed. And in the corner, you saw this.
Oh, that is perfect on every level.
Look at this. There's all that stuff dripping off of him. He was just creeping up there and he's like, hello. Hey, Andrew. I live in the hospital. What are you doing? Like that. If you're only listening to the audio of this, go look for the picture. That is the creepy troll.
I'm never
like getting that creepy though. My kids were all down here. We started clearing this out, and there's this like corner you turn. You kind of got to go through because you had to clear out to even get anywhere. And I hear one of them. What? There's something creeping in there, and that troll is what we discovered.
I'm assuming that it was, and at least I'm going to hope that was intentionally left by the people who occupied your space before you, and that they said, "Oh, This is going to be so funny.
I hope
we're going to creep the hell out of these people.
Yeah. So two things.
Now I want to be friends with them, whoever they are.
Well, you can decide after you hear these two additional factors. The family that lived here, stuff lived here for a long time from the time it was bought. Long time. They died elderly. The kids decided to rent it. They rented it to one family for a short period of time before we got here. We move in. There's a bad experience with this family. Behind all the radiators were soiled undergarments. And they were soiled by at least 3 types of things. And they were just cooking, behind the heaters when it got cold. So that was one experience, a surprise, along with this troll.
Who hasn't hidden their soiled panties and underwear behind a heater?
As one does.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah. Well, like 2 or 3 months ago, we had a moisture problem, and they finally agreed to put these fans in. They go to put the fan in. We can't figure out how to get power to this thing. We don't know how to get in your attic. Well, there's no attic here, we thought, for 3 years. Well, there is. There's a trap door. You go upstairs. That guy if we find it. This guy goes upstairs, and there's a whole second floor to this house. Children's toys, pull-out beds, all sorts of stuff, like Anne Frank style, right?
Just in time for you to move. Got it. Yeah.
Yeah. And we're like, what's going on? And about a whole new power cord every 2 or 3 feet. And we're like, oh, I guess it's easy to plug power for these lights and fans in because there's power cords run all upside. So we're freaking out, going like, did the people here before that had gotten removed from the house for breaking certain laws involving the sale of certain items and, all this kind of stuff, like, were they running a grow house up in the house? We're thinking first, there's a whole kind of glowing contraption with lights running through it, little igloo in the upstairs next to the room with the bed mattresses on the floor. Well, we're all freaking out. The guy there is installing, it's like, I've never seen anything like this before. Come to find out, the family that owned this place knew it was up there. They just didn't want anyone to know because it wasn't licensed. And granddad built it to stick the kids up there, and he thought they got loud. And I'm like, no one told me this. And we sit here all of lockdown. I've been sitting in this basement with a creepy troll staring at me, 4.5 foot high, having to run an air filter all the time that I change every other week because it's full of smut. And there's a whole nother floor is finished out. Oh, anyway, that's an unrelated to process theology, Andrew.
You should see if there's a sub basement below your basement. You never know.
You know what there is? This is creepy. We'll see if the editor leaves this in. All right. You see that? All those bottle tops right there?
Uh-huh.
Okay. So there was a cabinet over that whole thing. And when the first time it flooded down here, some weird smells were coming out of that hole. And so I moved this cabinet all the way off, and I realized there's a hole, and there are probably 15 or 20 gallon jugs full of some liquid in a hole where they dug into the foundation and placed these jugs there. And I just haven't messed with them. I just assume.
You haven't had the liquid tested to see what it is?
No, I'm not touching it. I'm like, not messing with this. Nothing about this space makes me feel like I need to open mysteries that are already closed off and covered. Because I'm like,
that's probably wise.
Are those buckets full of anything involving this friend, or is it something else? And with that, I want to thank Steve-O for figuring out how to edit the end of this episode. I want to thank Andrew for nailing multiple topics, introducing process thought, panentheism, tackling religious pluralism, ecological civilization, and describing the ways in which a process vision engages across disciplines. That was great. I want to thank the troll for still being creepy AF.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been fun.
All right. Smoochy boochies, peeps.